Paycheck Protection Program is over, but that does not mean that the fight has stopped, because there are more than 2 million businesses still sitting in queue with their PPP loans, hoping and waiting for funding. And I think it's really important to address everything that is going on, whether you have already received a PPP loan and you're curious about forgiveness, or if you're still waiting in queue. So we're going to talk about what just happened regarding the Paycheck Protection Program, the current proposals that are at hand, what the most likely options are, and some creative options that you may not have heard of before, a little bit on forgiveness and how that process may actually be simplified even further, and a little bit of news on fraud at the end of this video, an article that I thought was interesting. So in order to explain this, I've made a little handy dandy flowchart, the state of the Paycheck Protection Program. Also, I just wanted to say thank you to all of my new and existing, especially my subscribers who have been around for a long time, because we just passed 260,000 subscribers. That is mind-blowing. I'm so appreciative, and it like thinking about that number of people is honestly insane to me. So I appreciate each and every one of you so much. It's honestly insane. So let's get into the video here. The state of the Paycheck Protection Program. So starting off with today, what just happened? So new applicants will no longer be processed. And this actually happened last Friday on the 28th. The SBA sent out a notice to lenders saying, you can't submit any more loans to our portal. We are closing up shop early. It was supposed to close on the 31st of May. How it was aligned with the latest bill that was passed to extend the PPP. You could apply through May 31st, which didn't matter for most people. And then the SBA will process loans through the end of June. Well, a few days before that, May 28th, they said, we're closing up shop. We're done. No more funding left. And that means, yeah, you can't apply anymore, but there still is a fight for the people sitting in queue. A little bit more on this. The SBA reported that they received 125 new applications in the last 24 hours before they closed up shop. So they're like, funding's gone. What happened here was there was a little bit of funding left over for minority borrowers through minority institutions, and it seems that that funding is likely allocated already, counting these new applicants. So if you got in on time, you could still be okay. You could still be okay, even if you're not a minority borrower and your loan has been submitted to the SBA. There are many people who are still being funded who applied before even May 4th. Before even May 4th, they applied, it was sent to the SBA approved it, and basically when the SBA approves your loan, that funding is considered allocated. So we have that big pot of funding here, your loan gets approved, they put over that coin over on the other side, this is the allocated pot, and there's people still getting funded every single day. So remember, the SBA approves it, sends it to your lender then has 20 days to disperse those funds, and then there's another like 3 to 5 days that it can take for an ACH transfer to happen. So there's a period of time there where you might feel like, yeah, am I actually going to get funding, where you still could receive funding. So there's a little bit of a silver lining there. If you have actually been approved by the SBA, you have a promissory note, things like that. Now, moving on to current proposals. You might be familiar with these, so we're going to go over them real quick. The Rosen Plan. The proposal here is to process all loans submitted to the SBA by May 4th when funding ran out, and then give an additional $5 billion in funding to new loans, a targeted PPP, to businesses with 100 or fewer employees and in states with a 6% or higher unemployment rate. And this would give priority to minority groups as well. There's of course issues with this plan because $5 billion in funding only goes so far, and then process all loans submitted to the SBA isn't an exact term enough, and there's a lot of changes that would need to be made to this proposal before it was actually enacted. But it's a movement in the right direction, and I think there's great intentions here, and it's one of the only 2 proposals, so it's really better than nothing. And then we have the Cardin Plan, which offers the retroactive PPP for those who applied before the gross income criteria came into effect. And as of right now, you have no way to up your loan size, and the only reason that you received a smaller amount is you just applied and were funded earlier. It's just not a fair system. This addresses that. It also addresses a new revenue loss criteria. Instead of having to compare very definite quarters like quarter one, quarter two of 2019 with your revenue figures for your second draw PPP loan. You could use under this plan any contiguous 90-day period. That way there's a little bit more flexibility in order to open up the criteria. But of course, this doesn't matter if there's no additional funding in the program, and this bill doesn't outline any additional funding. So this would have to change massively in order for it to pass and actually do anything. So that's the two bills that we have proposed right now. But now let's talk about what's next. Our most likely options as to what could happen next with the Paycheck Protection Program. Starting with the very most likely, if something happens, this is the most likely option. However, we do have to be realistic here. We don't want to bank on this happening because progress has not been great. I assumed that there would be much more of a push by Congress and legislators and trade groups to get more PPP funding, and there simply has not. And then we tried with the grassroots approach to reach out to our Congress people, and it just hasn't built up as much steam as I had hoped or as really anyone expected, and it's been fairly disappointing. But either way, this is the most likely outcome if there's a solution. So it'd be some kind of small business relief act that first adds funds to the Restaurant Revitalization Fund. That program went well, but funds ran out very quickly, and there's a major need there for more funding. It would also offer some kind of micro PPP, which sounds very, very derogatory, and it'd be targeted in some way. I wrote why, it should be way, and that really bugs me. Type A personality, I guess, bugs that. So some kind of micro PPP that's a targeted Paycheck Protection Program, kind of like that Rosen plan with 100 or fewer employees, or maybe it would be a reduction in revenue of 50%, or some kind of more targeted criteria. That way they don't need to spend quite as much. And then on top of that, it would be some kind of farmer paycheck protection. Again, that's another form of targeted to help out farmers and ranchers. So that's the most likely outcome for additional relief. But we have other options as well. Here's option 2. Repurpose remaining EIDL funding to paycheck protection loans. Now, we don't know exactly how much EIDL funding will be used before those programs wrap up, and with current approval numbers, it may be a year before everyone is actually funded unless they figure out how to approve people a little bit faster. But either way, there seems to be a surplus of funding in the EIDL program, and that funding could be used for other things. It could be used to open up the $10,000 grant to all businesses or more businesses, lighten the criteria in order to make more businesses eligible, or it could be repurposed to the Paycheck Protection Program and fund loans that were already in queue, which would also be a good way to allocate this funding. And that would be a way where Congress doesn't have to actually spend any more money, and more businesses would be approved and get the relief that they need. So that would be a good way to facilitate some additional funding if it's not being used for something else. And then the third option, which is the option that most people would prefer, especially those who are sitting in queue, would just be new funding added with no additional guidelines or criteria, just adding something like $120 billion, which would both allow for the retroactive PPP to bump up from net income to gross income, and then approve the legitimate loans that are still sitting there in queue waiting to be processed. Now, we still don't know exactly what's going to happen with all of those loans sitting with the lender secondary review or some kind of hold code at the SBA. It seems the SBA is going to spend the month of June processing those and funding as many of those as possible. So I'm very hopeful that in the month of June, we see tons of these hold codes lifted and those loans go through, and hear more and more success stories of people who are stuck forever with some kind of SBA hold code and then finally receives funding, because in June, there won't be new loans being processed. Now, we won't know exactly if the program will be extended until probably the end of June, as to whether the SBA needs more time to approve these loans and go through hold codes as well. So there is a chance by the end of June where the SBA says, hey, we need more time, that could be extended, which also could open up other changes, like extending the approval, the application date for submitting an application, adding more funding. There's a chance there where if a change is needed, we could throw in other needed changes. So that's something to watch out for as well. So it's not completely over with. There are still changes that could happen. And then of course, there is concerns with forgiveness as well. And don't worry, I'm going to be reporting on forgiveness until all my followers are figured out and you feel comfortable with the forgiveness process. I know that there's a few months ahead of us still before everyone gets their loans forgiven, and we're good to go there. But we do have some good news with forgiveness. Recent stat, 69.5% of all 2020 PPP loans have already been forgiven. So it's a solid chunk of PPP loans, and even better, of the loans sitting in process for forgiveness, so they're sitting in queue waiting to be completely forgiven and approved, only 15% are loans under $1 million. So that's even smaller. I couldn't find the exact stat for loans under $20,000 for just one-person operations, but it seems by a far majority, small loans are just being approved, no problem. No problem whatsoever. It's a very simple form in order to get forgiveness, that 3508S. You don't even need documentation in most cases unless there's something suspicious on your application. So if you're concerned about forgiveness, we have some good news showing that forgiveness is very easy for small loans. Really, the only people who are having a little bit of a tough time with forgiveness are loans above $2 million, where there's a manual review for every single one of those, and the process is just taking a long time. But for small loans, very good news there. And then the SBA is also exploring new ways to make forgiveness even more simple. Right now, it's just a one-page form, no documentation required. I don't know how they could make it much more simple than that. I guess maybe just automatic forgiveness. I'm not sure what could happen there, but I've read that they're exploring ways to make that more simple. So we have a lot going on here. And then one additional thing that I wanted to talk about with paycheck protection fraud. I found a very interesting article on this. Here we can see Congress opens investigation into fraudulent loans facilitated by fintech lenders Bluevine and Cabbage. So this is interesting. Well, fintech lenders only process 15% of total PPP volume. They're involved in 75% of fraudulent loans. Now, that seems scary and it seems absurd on face value, but when you look at the actual information and consider the loan that they were processing, it makes a little bit more sense. So first, an investigation by ProPublica found that Cabbage facilitated 378 loans totaling $7 million to businesses that likely don't exist. Many of those were those fake farms that we've talked about here on this channel quite a bit. But what's interesting is Cabbage, first off, says that they have rigorous verification checks more than what the SBA requires, which if you've done a loan through any of these fintechs, they are pretty rigorous identification checks. Of course, there's always people getting through with fake loans, not so much at the tail end of the program, but this really highlights why this is happening, in my opinion. And this is because the largest banks, like JP Morgan Chase and Wells Fargo, prioritized existing customers that had already gone through compliance processes. So if you were trying to get a PPP loan back in May of last year, you'll remember how hard it was to get a PPP loan unless you already had an existing banking relationship. I had a video at the time that probably came out in May or June of last year that was a list of lenders that didn't require you to be an existing customer, and the list was only like 15 lenders. So it was very hard in the beginning for people who didn't have a strong banking relationship to get a loan. So what this means is the fintechs came in and solved the problem of helping people who didn't have an existing relationship at one of these big banks, or the big banks were like, we don't care about your $10,000 loan. So they filled the need there, but then what happens is these aren't existing customers with an existing relationship with those fintechs, and by default, the people trying to get fraud who don't have an existing relationship are going to go to the fintech. So it makes sense that happens. And of course, we don't know on the security end, does a bank like Chase have much higher security than a facilitator like Cabbage? I can't say. That's just conjecture. It'd be a guess on my end, but it's definitely, in part at least, due to non-existing customers flocking to those fintechs, but I thought this was interesting nevertheless. So that's going to do it for this update. Like I said, I am not going anywhere. I will continue to update you throughout this process, any changes that you need to know. Again, thank you to all my new and existing subscribers. You're so amazing, and I hope you have a wonderful Memorial Day, and think about those who have fought for our country and for us to be able to complain about a program like the Paycheck Protection Program. So thank you again for watching, and I hope you have a profitable day.